The last time I saw my mother's face, she was standing at the edge of our gravel driveway, one hand raised in a wave that never quite finished. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, and I remember thinking she looked smaller somehow, like the years had been quietly stealing pieces of her while I wasn't paying attention. I was 17 years old, desperate to escape the suffocating smallness of Harlan County, Kentucky, and I didn't look back. Not once. I just climbed into that rusted pickup truck with a boy whose name I can barely remember now and drove toward a future I was certain would be better than anything that tired little town could offer me. That was March of 1979. By December of that same year, everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and myself would shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. And the name that would haunt me for the next 4 decades wasn't the name of any boy or any dream I'd chased. It was a name I'd never heard spoken aloud in our house, a name that had been buried so deep in my family's history that uncovering it would change everything. Vickie Lynn Belk. If you're watching this right now, I need you to understand something. This isn't just my story. This is a story about secrets, about the lies families tell to protect themselves, and about the devastating truth that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who share our blood. If you've ever felt like something was missing in your life, like there was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, then you already know why you need to stay until the very end. And I'm asking you right now, before we go any further, to share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because what I'm about to tell you might just save somebody's life. It might give someone the courage to dig into their own family's past and find the truth that's been hidden from them. Do it now. I'll wait. Good. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in a house that sat at the bottom of a hill so steep that every winter, we'd watch cars slide down the icy road like toys pushed by an invisible hand. My father worked the coal mines until his lungs couldn't take it anymore, and my mother, she worked at the diner on Main Street, the one with the cracked linoleum floors and the coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Eisenhower administration. We weren't poor, not by Harlan County standards, but we weren't comfortable either. We existed in that gray space between making ends meet and watching those ends fray at the edges. I had 2 brothers, both older, both gone by the time I was 12. Marcus joined the Army and shipped off to a place he never talked about when he came back. Daniel, he just disappeared one night, left a note that said he was heading to California to find himself. Mama never spoke his name after that, and Daddy just shook his head whenever anyone asked. It was like Daniel had died, only nobody had bothered to hold a funeral. But here's the thing that always nagged at me, even when I was too young to understand why. In our house, there were photographs on every wall. Pictures of me as a baby, pictures of Marcus in his uniform, pictures of my parents on their wedding day looking young and hopeful and nothing like the tired strangers they'd become. But there were gaps, spaces on the wall where pictures should have been, rectangles of wallpaper that were slightly brighter than the faded paper around them, like someone had removed photographs and never bothered to replace them. I asked my mother about it once, when I was maybe 10 or 11. She was standing at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, and I remember how still she went when I asked the question. Just for a second, just long enough for me to notice. Those were old pictures, she said, not looking at me. Pictures of people who aren't part of our lives anymore. Who? I pressed. Family. She turned then, and there was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. It was there and gone so fast I might have imagined it. Some people aren't meant to be remembered, Sarah Jane. Some people are better off forgotten. And that was it. End of conversation. I learned early that there were doors in our house that didn't open, questions that didn't get answered, and silences that stretched so long you could drown in them. But I never stopped wondering. When I was 16, I found the box. It was shoved in the back of my parents' closet, behind my father's old work boots and a stack of quilts my grandmother had made before she passed. A simple cardboard box, the kind you'd get from the grocery store, with the edges worn soft from age. There was no label on it, nothing to indicate what was inside, but something about it called to me. Something about the way it was hidden, like a secret waiting to be discovered. I waited until my parents were both at work, until the house was empty and quiet, and the only sound was the wind rattling the windows in their frames. Then I pulled that box out of the closet and opened it. Inside, I found photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of a girl I'd never seen before, a girl with dark hair and my mother's eyes. She looked to be about my age in most of the pictures, maybe a little younger. In some, she was smiling at the camera with a brightness that seemed almost painful. In others, she stood beside my mother, and they looked so similar they could have been twins. At the bottom of the box, underneath all those photographs, I found a newspaper clipping. The paper was yellow and brittle, and when I unfolded it, pieces crumbled away like dead leaves. The headline read, "Local girl missing, foul play suspected." And beneath that, a name, Vickie Lynn Belk, 16. The date on the newspaper was October 15th, 1962. 17 years before I was born. I sat there on my parents' bedroom floor, holding that newspaper clipping, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Because the girl in those photographs, the girl who'd gone missing in 1962, wasn't just someone my mother knew. She was my mother's sister. A sister I never knew existed. A sister whose name had never been spoken in our house. A sister who had vanished into thin air and been erased from our family history like she'd never existed at all. And as I stared at that photograph, at those eyes that were so much like my mother's, I realized something that made my blood run cold. She also looked exactly like me. I put everything back in that box exactly the way I'd found it. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped photographs twice, watched them flutter to the floor like wounded birds. I was terrified my parents would somehow know I'd been in there, that they'd sense the disturbance in the air, smell my fear lingering in their bedroom like smoke after a fire. For 3 days, I didn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my parents moving through the house like ghosts. The creak of the floorboards under my father's heavy footsteps. The whisper of my mother's slippers as she padded to the kitchen in the dark hours of the morning when she thought everyone was asleep. I heard her crying once, soft and muffled like she was pressing her face into a pillow, and I wondered if she was crying for Vickie Lynn. If she'd been crying for her sister all these years, carrying that grief in silence because no one in the house was allowed to acknowledge that Vickie had ever existed at all. I started watching my mother differently after that. I noticed the way she tensed when certain songs came on the radio. The way she avoided looking at young girls who walked past the diner window. The way she sometimes got this faraway look in her eyes, like she was seeing something none of us could see, remembering something she'd never share. But I didn't ask questions. Not yet. I was too afraid of the answers. Instead, I started doing my own research. Harlan County didn't have much of a library, but it had enough. I spent my afternoons in the musty basement of the county records office, poring over old newspapers, microfiche, anything I could find that mentioned Vickie Lynn Belk and her disappearance. What I learned made the mystery even deeper. Vickie Lynn Belk had been 16 years old in October of 1962. She'd been a junior at Harlan High School, an honor student, a member of the church choir. Everyone who was interviewed described her the same way. Sweet, kind, the type of girl who never had a bad word to say about anyone. She'd been helping her mother prepare for a church social the night she vanished. She'd walked to the corner store to pick up a bag of sugar and never came home. The search had lasted for weeks. Police from 3 counties joined in. Volunteers combed the mountains, the hollows, the abandoned mine shafts that dotted the landscape like wounds in the earth. They found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not a single trace of Vickie Lynn Belk. She had simply ceased to exist. There were suspects, of course. There always are in cases like these. The newspapers mentioned a drifter who'd been seen in town that week, a man with no name and no history who disappeared around the same time Vickie did. There was talk of a local man, someone whose name was never printed but whose shadow seemed to loom over every article I read. And there was Vickie's boyfriend, a young man named Thomas Earl Crenshaw, who'd been questioned multiple times but never charged with anything. The case went cold. The years passed, and Vickie Lynn Belk became just another ghost story, whispered about on dark nights when the wind howled through the mountains and the old-timers gathered around their wood stoves to talk about things better left forgotten. But my mother hadn't forgotten. She'd just stopped speaking. I found her one afternoon, sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. I'd come home early from school, and she hadn't heard me come in. There was a cup of coffee in front of her, untouched and long cold, and her hands were wrapped around it like she was trying to warm herself from the inside out. "Mama," I said, and she jumped like I'd fired a gun. "Sarah Jane." She pressed a hand to her chest. "Lord, child, you scared me half to death." "I'm sorry." I stood in the doorway, uncertain. "Are you okay?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired, baby. Just tired." I should have left it alone. I should have walked away, gone to my room, pretended I'd never found that box or seen those photographs. But something pushed me forward, some desperate need to understand that overrode every instinct telling me to stay silent. "Mama," I said, "who was Vickie Lynn Belk?" The change that came over her face was something I'll never forget. It was like watching a light go out, like seeing someone die while their body kept breathing. The color drained from her cheeks, her eyes went flat and hard, and when she spoke, her voice was someone else's entirely. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found the box," I admitted. "In your closet." "I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have been looking, but I found the pictures and the newspaper clipping and I just need to know. She was your sister, wasn't she? What happened to her?" My mother stood up so fast her chair fell backward, crashing against the floor. She came toward me, and for one terrifying moment, I thought she was going to hit me. I'd never been afraid of my mother before, not once in my life. But in that moment, I was afraid. "You don't say that name in this house," she hissed. "You don't ever say that name. Do you understand me?" "But Mama, Vickie is gone." Her voice cracked on the word, and I saw tears spilling down her cheeks. "She's been gone for 17 years, and she's not coming back. And I don't want you digging around in things that don't concern you. Nothing good can come from it. Nothing. I just want to understand. Some things aren't meant to be understood, Sarah Jane. Some things are meant to stay buried." She pushed past me and locked herself in her bedroom. I heard her crying through the door, great heaving sobs that seemed to shake the walls, and I stood there in the hallway, paralyzed with guilt and confusion and a burning need to know more that I couldn't control. That night, I made a decision. I was going to find out what happened to Vickie Lynn Belk, no matter what it cost me. I started with the one person who might be willing to talk, Thomas Earl Crenshaw, Vickie's boyfriend from all those years ago. It took me a week to track him down. He wasn't in Harlan anymore. He'd moved to a small town about 40 miles north, a place called Everts that was even smaller and more forgotten than the town I'd grown up in. I borrowed my friend Jolene's car, told my parents I was spending the night at her house, and drove to Everts on a Saturday morning in early April. The trees were just starting to bud, and the mountains were wearing that soft green haze that always reminded me of hope, of new beginnings, of things coming back to life after the long death of winter. Thomas Earl Crenshaw lived in a trailer at the edge of town, a rusted single-wide with a sagging porch and a yard full of car parts and broken dreams. I sat in Jolene's car for a long time, watching the trailer, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. I was 17 years old and about to ask a stranger about a crime that had happened before I was born. I had no business being there. But Vickie Lynn Belk had looked exactly like me. I couldn't shake the feeling that her story and mine were connected somehow, that understanding what had happened to her would help me understand something about myself that I didn't even know I was missing. I got out of the car and walked up to the porch. The man who answered the door was in his mid-30s, tall and lean with eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched the color drain from his face. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Vickie." And in that moment, I knew I was on the right path. Thomas Earl Crenshaw staggered backward like I'd struck him. His hand found the doorframe for support, and he blinked at me with eyes gone wide and wild. For several heartbeats, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees behind me, making a sound like whispers, like secrets passing from branch to branch. "I'm not Vickie," I finally said. "I'm Sarah Jane. Sarah Jane Combs. I think Vickie was my aunt." He let out a long, shaky breath and pressed a hand to his forehead. Lord Almighty. For a second there, I thought. I don't know what I thought. It's been 17 years, and you look just like her. Just exactly like her. Can I come in? I need to talk to you about what happened. He hesitated, studying my face like he was searching for something. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the dim interior of the trailer. I don't know what I can tell you that the police didn't already hear 100 times, but come in. I'll do what I can. The inside of the trailer smelled like cigarette smoke and loneliness. Thomas cleared a stack of newspapers off a worn armchair and motioned for me to sit. He sank onto the couch across from me, and I noticed his hands were still trembling. "You're Ruth's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. I should have known. You got her eyes, underneath all that, Vickie. But the rest of you, the hair, the shape of your face, that's pure Vickie Lynn. He shook his head slowly. Ruth and I haven't spoken since the year after Vickie disappeared. She blamed me, never said it outright, but I could see it in the way she looked at me. Like I was the one who took her sister away. Did you? I asked, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Sadness, maybe, or resignation. No, he said quietly. I loved Vickie. I would have married her if she'd have me. I was going to ask her the night she disappeared. Had her ring and everything. Saved up for 6 months working at the feed store. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Never got the chance. Then what happened to her? He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray afternoon like it held answers I couldn't see. That's the question, isn't it? That's what everybody's been asking for 17 years. I wish to God I knew. The newspapers mentioned a drifter. And someone else, someone local whose name they wouldn't print. Thomas turned to face me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Or old anger that had never quite died. The drifter was a dead end. They tracked him down in Virginia about 3 months later. He had an alibi for the whole week he was in Harlan. Couldn't have been him. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. As for the other one, that was Randall Mays. The name meant nothing to me, but something about the way Thomas said it made my skin prickle. Who was Randall Mays? Foreman at one of the smaller mines. Everybody knew he was no good. He had a reputation, if you know what I mean. Liked young girls. Liked him too young. There were rumors, stories people told behind closed doors, but nobody ever had proof and nobody ever pressed charges. His family had money, had connections. That meant something back then. Still does, I reckon. You think he took Vickie? Thomas sat back down, and when he looked at me, I saw that he was fighting to control himself. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. I know he did. I've known it for 17 years, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. Never was. How do you know? Because I saw them together. 2 days before she disappeared, I saw Vickie coming out of the woods behind the old Methodist church. Randall was with her. He had his hand on her arm, and she was crying. I called out to her, but she just ran. When I got to the spot where they'd been standing, Randall was gone. Vanished like smoke. Did you tell the police? Of course I did. I told them everything. But Randall had an alibi. His wife swore up and down that he was home with her all night the evening Vickie went missing. His brother backed her up. And who were the police gonna believe? A mine foreman with a good family name, or some 18-year-old kid who worked at the feed store? I sat there, processing what he was telling me. My aunt had been taken by a man everyone knew was dangerous. A man who'd been protected by his money and his connections, while a 16-year-old girl vanished into thin air. And my mother had known. She had to have known. That was why she'd erased Vickie from our family history, why she couldn't bear to speak her sister's name. The grief and guilt of knowing who'd taken Vickie and being powerless to do anything about it must have been eating her alive for nearly 2 decades. Let me ask you something right now. If you knew someone had hurt a member of your family, if you knew they'd gotten away with something unforgivable, what would you do? Would you stay silent and let the grief consume you? Or would you find a way to make things right, no matter how long it took? I want you to think about that, really think about it, and then leave a comment telling me what you would do. Because what I did next might surprise you. Or maybe, if you've ever loved someone you lost, it won't surprise you at all. Where is Randall Mays now? I asked. Thomas's expression darkened. Still in Harlan. Still living in that big house his daddy built. His wife died a few years back, and his brother moved to Tennessee. Last I heard, he was alone up there, getting old and mean and waiting to die. He never paid for what he did. No, he never did. I stood up, and Thomas stood with me. He looked at me with something like concern in his eyes. What are you thinking about doing, Sarah Jane? I don't know yet. Whatever it is, be careful. Randall Mays is a dangerous man. He's old now, but that doesn't mean he's not still dangerous. And if he really did take Vickie, if he really did what I think he did, then there's nothing he won't do to keep that secret buried. I thanked Thomas for talking to me and walked back to Jolene's car. The drive home felt longer than it should have, and my mind was racing the entire way. I had a name now. I had a suspect, but I didn't have proof. I didn't have anything that would make people believe me, anything that would finally bring justice for a girl who'd been dead since before I was born. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. When I got home that night, my mother was waiting for me. She was sitting in the dark living room, the same way I'd found her at the kitchen table. Only this time there was no pretense of coffee or casual exhaustion. She looked at me, and I knew that she knew where I'd been. You talked to Thomas, she said. Yes. And he told you about Randall. Yes. My mother closed her eyes, and in the dim light from the window, I could see the tears sliding down her cheeks. I begged you to leave this alone, Sarah Jane. I begged you. I couldn't, Mama. I needed to know. And now you know. She opened her eyes, and they were hollow, empty. Now you know that the man who took my sister has been living less than 5 miles from us my whole life. Now you know that I've had to see his face in town, had to watch him walk free while Vickie rotted in whatever grave he put her in. Now you know the thing that's been killing me for 17 years. I went to her then, knelt beside her chair, and took her hands in mine. They were cold, so cold. Why didn't you ever do anything? I asked. Why didn't you try to make him pay? My mother looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw 17 years of rage and helplessness and grief that had nowhere to go. Because I couldn't prove it, she whispered. Because nobody would believe me. Because in this town, the Mays family is untouchable, and my family was nothing. We were poor, we were powerless, and when Vickie disappeared, we didn't matter enough for anyone to care about the truth. I felt something shift inside me then. Something hard and cold and determined. You matter, Mama, I said. Vickie mattered, and I'm going to prove what Randall Mays did. I don't care how long it takes. I'm going to make him pay. My mother shook her head. You can't. You're just a child. You don't understand what you're up against. Then help me understand. Tell me everything you remember about Vickie's disappearance. Tell me everything you never told the police. Help me find the truth. For a long moment, my mother didn't speak. Then, slowly, she began to talk. And what she told me changed everything. My mother talked until the dawn light crept through the windows and the birds began their morning songs. She told me things she'd never spoken aloud, secrets she'd carried for 17 years like stones in her pockets, weighing her down, dragging her under. She told me that Vickie hadn't been heading to the corner store for sugar the night she disappeared. That was the story they'd told the police, the neighbors, the newspapers. The truth was different. Vickie had been meeting someone. In the weeks before she vanished, Vickie had been acting strangely. Secretive. Afraid. She'd stopped going to choir practice, stopped eating dinner with the family, stopped sleeping through the night. My mother, who'd been 14 at the time, had watched her sister retreat into herself and hadn't known how to help. She tried asking, but Vickie just shook her head and said it was nothing, said she was fine, said everything would be okay soon. The night Vickie disappeared, my mother had followed her. She hadn't meant to. She'd been worried. That was all. Worried about her big sister who'd been acting like a ghost for weeks. So when Vickie slipped out the back door after supper, my mother had pulled on her shoes and gone after her. Vickie walked fast, her head down, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. She didn't go to the corner store. She went to the old Brennan place, an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town where nobody had lived in years. The windows were boarded up, the porch was sagging, and the whole property had an air of decay that made my mother's skin crawl. But Vickie walked right up to that house like she'd been there 100 times before. My mother hid behind a tree and watched as her sister knocked on the back door. A light came on inside. The door opened, and Randall Mays stepped out. He was dressed in work clothes, like he'd come straight from the mine, and his face was hard and angry. He grabbed Vickie by the arm and pulled her inside, and the door slammed shut behind them. My mother waited. She didn't know what else to do. She was 14 years old, alone in the dark, watching something she didn't understand. Minutes passed. Then she heard Vickie scream. It was cut off almost immediately, like someone had clamped a hand over her mouth. My mother wanted to run to the house, wanted to break down the door and save her sister, but she was frozen, paralyzed with fear. She stood behind that tree and did nothing while her sister screamed inside that abandoned house. Then the light went out. The back door opened, and Randall Mays walked out alone. He was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in a blanket. He put the bundle in the back of his truck, got behind the wheel, and drove away. My mother never saw Vickie again. Why didn't you tell anyone? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My mother's face crumpled. I was afraid. I was so afraid. Randall Mays was a powerful man, and I was just a child. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what would happen to me? To our family? His people would have destroyed us. They would have made our lives a living hell. So you just kept quiet. I tried to tell. Her voice broke. A few weeks after Vickie disappeared, I worked up the courage. I went to Sheriff Daniels and told him everything I'd seen. He listened. He wrote it all down. And then he told me that Randall Mays had been at a church meeting the night Vickie vanished, with a dozen witnesses to prove it. He said I was a confused child, traumatized by my sister's disappearance. He said I'd imagined the whole thing. But you didn't. No. I know what I saw. I've known for 17 years, and every day of my life, I've wished I'd been brave enough to do something. To stop him. To save her. She looked at me with eyes full of ancient grief. And now you're telling me you want to go after him? Sarah Jane, I can't let you do that. I can't lose you too. You won't lose me, Mama. But I'm not going to let this go. Randall Mays is going to pay for what he did. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to find a way. She didn't try to stop me. I think some part of her was tired of carrying the secret, tired of living with the guilt. Maybe she even believed that I could do what she never could. I started my investigation the next day. The first thing I did was research the old Brennan place. It had been demolished in 1965, 3 years after Vickie's disappearance. The land had been sold and developed into a strip mall that now housed a Piggly Wiggly and a hardware store. If there had ever been evidence at that farmhouse, it was long gone. But the land where Randall Mays had driven that night, the land where my mother had watched him carry away her sister's body, that might still exist. I needed to find out where he'd gone. I started talking to people. Not directly, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but carefully. I hung around the diner where my mother worked and listened to the old-timers talk. I asked innocent questions, got them reminiscing about the old days. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. Randall Mays owned a piece of property outside of town. It had been in his family for generations, 100 acres of mountain land that nobody ever visited. There were rumors about that property, stories people told in low voices when they thought no one was listening. A hunter had gone up there once and come back pale and shaking, refusing to say what he'd seen. A group of teenagers had tried to camp there and fled in the middle of the night, swearing they'd heard a woman crying in the woods. Nobody went to the Mays property. It was cursed, they said, haunted by something that couldn't rest. I knew in my bones that Vickie was there, but I couldn't just walk onto Randall Mays' land and start digging. I needed proof. I needed a plan. And I needed help. I found it in an unexpected place. His name was Marcus Bellamy, and he worked for the county records office. He was young, barely older than me, with kind eyes and a burning desire to do something meaningful with his life. We met when I came in to request property records, and something about the way I asked my questions must have caught his attention. "You're looking into the Mays family," he said, not quite a question. "Yes." "Why?" I looked at him, this stranger with kind eyes, and made a decision. "Because Randall Mays killed my aunt 17 years ago, and I'm going to prove it." Marcus stared at me for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I believe you," he said, "and I think I can help." Marcus Bellamy became my partner in everything that followed. He had access to records I couldn't get, knew people who could provide information without asking too many questions. And he had his own reasons for wanting to see Randall Mays brought to justice. His sister had disappeared in 1975. Nobody had ever connected it to Randall Mays, but Marcus had always suspected. The circumstances were too similar. A young girl, 16 years old, vanishing without a trace. A search that led nowhere. A case that went cold and was eventually forgotten by everyone except the people who loved her. Together, Marcus and I began to build a case. We mapped every piece of property Randall Mays owned or had ever owned. We tracked his movements on the nights when girls had gone missing. We found patterns, connections, evidence that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. And then, in late November of 1979, we found the cabin. It was on the back edge of the Mays property, hidden in a hollow so deep the sun probably never reached it. The cabin wasn't on any official maps. It didn't exist on paper. But satellite images from a government survey told a different story. Someone had been using that cabin. Recently, Marcus and I made a plan. We would go to the cabin, document everything we found, and take it to the state police. Not the local sheriff, who was probably in Randall Mays' pocket, but the state authorities who might actually do something. We set out on the first Saturday of December, armed with cameras and flashlights and a determination that bordered on recklessness. We had no idea what we were walking into. The mountain was silent as death when we reached the property line. Marcus had parked his truck a mile down the road, and we'd hiked in through the woods, following a path that barely existed anymore. The trees pressed in on all sides, their bare branches reaching toward the gray December sky like skeletal fingers. I'd never been so scared in my life. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. But I kept putting one foot in front of the other, because somewhere on this land, my aunt was waiting to be found. Somewhere in these woods, Vickie Lynn Belk had spent the last 17 years, forgotten by the world but not by the people who loved her. Not anymore. The cabin came into view just as the sun was starting to set. It was exactly what I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined all at once. A simple wooden structure, weathered gray by decades of mountain winters, with a rusted tin roof and windows covered with dark cloth. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Marcus grabbed my arm. "Someone's in there," he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We hadn't expected Randall to be here. We'd watched his house for days, noted his habits, planned our trip for when he was supposed to be in town at his weekly poker game. Something had changed. "We should leave," Marcus said. "Come back when it's empty." But I couldn't. I'd come too far, gotten too close. The answer to 17 years of silence was inside that cabin, and I wasn't going to walk away. "You go back," I said. "If I'm not at the truck in 2 hours, drive to the state police and tell them everything." "Sarah Jane, this is crazy." "Maybe, but I have to know." Before he could stop me, I was moving toward the cabin, keeping low, using the trees for cover. I could hear Marcus behind me, cursing under his breath, but he didn't try to stop me. He followed. We reached the side of the cabin and pressed ourselves against the wall. Through a gap in the cloth covering the window, I could see inside. Randall Mays was sitting in a chair by the fire. He was old now, older than I'd expected, with white hair and a face creased by years of keeping secrets. He was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, staring into the flames like he was looking at something only he could see. But he wasn't alone. There was a woman tied to a chair in the corner of the cabin. She was young, maybe 18 or 19, with dark hair and terrified eyes. Duct tape covered her mouth, and her wrists were bound with rope. She was alive, struggling against her bonds, trying to scream through the gag. And on the wall behind her, arranged in a row like trophies, were photographs. Photographs of young girls. Dozens of them. Arranged by date, labeled with names and years. I saw Vickie Lynn Belk in the center, her school photograph from 1962. I saw Marcus's sister beside her, labeled with the year 1975. And there were others, so many others, stretching back decades and forward to what must have been recent additions. Randall Mays wasn't just a murderer. He was a collector, a serial predator who'd been hunting in these mountains for longer than I'd been alive. I felt Marcus's hand on my shoulder, squeezing hard. When I looked at him, I saw tears streaming down his face. "His sister," he whispered. "That's his sister. We had to do something. We couldn't wait for the police, couldn't leave that girl in there with a monster. But we were unarmed, outmatched, two young people against a man who'd been evading justice for decades." I made a decision. I'm going to distract him, I said. When he comes outside, you get her out. That's insane. He'll kill you. Maybe. But I'm the one who looks like Vickie. I'm the one who might make him hesitate. Before Marcus could argue, I stepped around the corner of the cabin and walked to the front door. I knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps, heavy and slow. The door opened, and Randall Mays looked at me. The color drained from his face. His hand, still holding the whiskey bottle, began to shake. And in that moment, I saw something I never expected to see in the eyes of a monster. Fear. Vickie. His voice was barely a whisper. Not quite, I said, but close enough. My name is Sarah Jane Combs. Ruth Belk is my mother, and I know what you did to her sister. Randall stared at me, and I watched the fear give way to something else. Calculation. Cunning. The mind of a predator assessing a threat. You shouldn't have come here, girl, he said. This is private property. You're trespassing. And you're a murderer. I have evidence. I have photographs. And in about an hour, the state police are going to be crawling all over this mountain. It was a bluff, but he didn't know that. I saw doubt flicker across his face, saw him weighing his options. Kill me and try to run? Or try to talk his way out of it like he'd done so many times before? You don't know what you're talking about, he said. Vickie Belk ran away with a drifter. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what you told them to believe. But I know the truth. I know about the old Brennan place. I know about my mother watching you carry Vickie's body to your truck. And I know about the girl you have tied up in there right now. That last part broke him. I saw it happen, saw the mask slip and the monster underneath emerge. His face twisted with rage, and he lunged at me. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear Randall behind me, cursing and stumbling, but he was old, and I was young, and fear gave me wings. Behind me, I heard Marcus shouting. I heard glass break. I heard the girl scream. And then I heard the gunshot. I stopped running. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Slowly, I turned around and made my way back toward the cabin. Marcus was standing on the porch, a rifle in his hands. Randall Mays was on the ground at the bottom of the steps, clutching his leg and howling in pain. Blood was pooling beneath him, staining the frozen ground red. The girl was free, sobbing in the doorway, the ropes that had bound her lying at her feet. I found the gun in the cabin, Marcus said, his voice shaking. He came back while I was untying her. I didn't have a choice. I walked past him and stood over Randall Mays. He looked up at me with eyes full of hatred and fear and something that might have been disbelief. You can't prove anything, he spat. You're just kids. Nobody will believe you. I knelt down beside him, looked into his eyes, and smiled. Maybe not, I said. But they'll believe the photographs on your wall. They'll believe the girl you kidnapped. And they'll believe what they find when they dig up this mountain. Then I stood up and walked away. We tied Randall up with his own rope and used his truck to drive to the main road. Marcus stayed with him while I took the girl to the nearest payphone and called the state police. I told them everything. I told them about Vickie Lynn Belk and the other girls on the wall. I told them about the cabin and the mountain and 17 years of secrets waiting to be uncovered. And this time, someone listened. The next 6 months were the hardest of my life. The state police descended on the Mays property like an army. They brought dogs, forensic teams, ground-penetrating radar. They dug up every inch of that mountain, sifted through every ounce of soil. They found 11 bodies. 11 young women, ranging in age from 14 to 19, buried in shallow graves across the property. Some had been there for decades. Others were more recent. All of them had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. Vickie Lynn Belk was among them. My mother identified her by the necklace she'd been wearing, a simple gold cross that had belonged to our grandmother. Vickie had never taken it off, and after 17 years in the ground, it was still there, still clasped around what remained of her neck. We buried her properly on a bright spring morning in April. The whole county came out, it seemed like. People who remembered her, people who'd searched for her all those years ago, people who just wanted to pay their respects to a girl who'd been taken too soon and forgotten for too long. My mother stood at the graveside, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked at peace. She can rest now, she said, squeezing my hand. My sister can finally rest. Randall Mays went to trial in the fall. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs on his wall, the testimony of the girl we'd rescued, the forensic evidence from the bodies he'd buried. His lawyers tried every trick in the book, but nothing could save him. He was convicted of 11 counts of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to death. I was there when they read the verdict. I watched his face as the judge pronounced the sentence, watched the realization dawn that he would never hurt anyone again. He didn't look at me, not once. I don't think he could, but I looked at him. I looked at the man who'd taken my aunt from this world, who'd stolen her future and left her family in ruins. I looked at him, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just exhaustion. And beneath that, the faintest stirring of something that might have been pity. Because Randall Mays was a monster, but he was also a man. A man who'd made choices, terrible choices, and now had to face the consequences. A man who would die alone in a prison cell, despised by the world, forgotten by history. Vickie Lynn Belk would be remembered. The other girls would be remembered. Their names would be spoken, their stories told, their graves tended by people who loved them. Randall Mays would disappear into the darkness he'd created. And somehow, that felt like justice. Marcus Bellamy was there when the verdict was read too. He'd testified at the trial, told the jury about his sister and how he'd spent years suspecting the truth without being able to prove it. We'd become close in the months since that night at the cabin, close in a way I'd never been close to anyone. After the trial, we stood on the courthouse steps and watched the crowd disperse. "What now?" he asked. I looked at him, this man who'd helped me find the truth, who'd risked his life to save a stranger, who'd stood beside me through the darkest days of my life. "I don't know," I admitted. For 17 years, this was my mother's purpose. Finding out what happened to Vickie. And now we know. Now it's over. I guess I have to figure out what comes next. "You could stay here," he said. "Finish school. Build a life. Is that what you're going to do?" He smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from him in months. "I was thinking about leaving, actually. Going somewhere new. Starting fresh." He paused. "I was hoping you might come with me." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about everything I'd been through, everything I'd lost, everything I'd found. I thought about my mother and the peace in her eyes and the way she'd finally started to heal. "Yes," I said. "I think I'd like that." We left Harlan County at the end of May, loaded up Marcus's truck with everything we owned, and drove west. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know what we'd find when we got there. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. And somewhere, I knew, Vickie Lynn Belk was smiling. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Marcus and I settled in Arizona, as far from Kentucky and its mountains as we could get. The desert felt like another planet after a lifetime of hollows and ridges, but I learned to love it. The endless sky, the painted sunsets, the way the landscape stretched out forever, hiding nothing. We got married on a Tuesday afternoon, just the two of us and a justice of the peace who looked like he'd seen it all and was happy to see two young people in love. My mother came out for the wedding, her first time on an airplane, and she cried through the whole ceremony. Happy tears, she insisted, though I knew they were mixed with grief for the daughter who should have been there but never would be. We built a life together, Marcus and I. He went back to school, got a degree in criminal justice, became an investigator for the state. I became a teacher, then a counselor, working with young people who'd been through trauma. I understood them in ways others couldn't. I'd been where they were. I knew that darkness didn't have to be the end of the story. My mother came to live with us when my father passed in 1985. She brought boxes of photographs with her, and for the first time, Vickie's pictures hung on our walls alongside family portraits and wedding snapshots. She talked about her sister freely now, telling stories I'd never heard, laughing at memories that had been too painful to touch for so many years. "She would have loved you," my mother said one night, looking at a picture of Vickie at 16. "She would have been so proud of what you did." "I didn't do it alone," I reminded her. "You told me the truth. Thomas gave me the lead. Marcus helped me find the evidence. It took all of us." "But you started it," she said. "You asked the question I was too afraid to ask. You refused to let her be forgotten." She reached out and took my hand. You gave me my sister back, Sarah Jane. I can never thank you enough for that. Randall Mays died in prison in 1992. I read about it in the newspaper, a small article buried in the back pages, announcing that a convicted serial killer had succumbed to cancer in his cell. No family claimed the body. No funeral was held. He was cremated by the state, and his ashes disposed of according to protocol. I felt nothing when I read it. No satisfaction. No relief. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. But the story didn't end with Randall Mays. In 1995, I received a letter from a woman named Patricia Delgado. She was the daughter of one of Randall's victims, a girl named Elena who'd vanished in 1970. Patricia had been searching for information about her mother for 20 years, and somehow, she'd found my name. She wanted to meet. She wanted to talk. She wanted to understand. I invited her to our home in Arizona, and we spent 3 days together, sharing stories and tears and photographs. Elena had been 17 when she died, a bright and beautiful girl with dreams of becoming a nurse. Patricia had been 2 years old when her mother disappeared. I don't remember her, Patricia said, holding a picture of Elena that I'd recovered from the trial evidence. Not really, just impressions. The smell of her perfume, the sound of her laugh. I've spent my whole life trying to hold on to something that slipped away before I was old enough to understand. She loved you, I said. Whatever happened, whatever Randall did, he couldn't take that away. How do you know? I thought of Vickie, of the photographs in that box, of my mother's tears, and the way she'd carried her sister's memory through decades of silence. Because love doesn't disappear, I said. It just changes form. Patricia became part of our family after that. She visited every year, brought her children to meet the woman who'd helped bring her mother's killer to justice. We exchanged letters and phone calls, shared holidays and milestones. I realized, somewhere along the way, that my journey hadn't ended with Randall's conviction. It had just begun. The truth I'd uncovered about Vickie had rippled outward, touching lives I'd never imagined. The families of the other victims had found closure because of what Marcus and I did. The community had been forced to confront its own complicity, its willingness to look the other way when powerful men did terrible things. Things changed after the trial. People talked more openly about abuse and violence, about the importance of believing victims and investigating claims. The sheriff who dismissed my mother's testimony all those years ago resigned in disgrace. New protocols were put in place. New laws were passed. Vickie's death had mattered, not because dying was noble or meaningful, but because the truth of what happened to her had forced change, had saved other lives. That was her legacy. That was what remained. I'm 73 years old now. Marcus passed 2 winters ago, quietly, in his sleep, with my hand in his and 47 years of marriage behind us. I miss him every day, but I don't grieve him the way I might have. He lived a full life. He died surrounded by love. There are worse fates. My mother lived to be 92. In the end, she was at peace. She talked about Vickie often, told stories I'd heard 100 times and never tired of hearing. When she closed her eyes for the last time, she was smiling. I live alone now, in a little house in the desert that Marcus and I picked out together. Our children visit often, bringing grandchildren who ask questions about the old photographs on the walls. I tell them the stories. I tell them about Vickie Lynn Belk, about the mystery of her disappearance and the long road to justice. I tell them about courage and persistence, about the importance of speaking truth even when no one wants to listen. They listen the way children listen to old stories, half believing, half wondering if Grandma is making it all up. But they remember. I see it in their eyes sometimes, a spark of recognition, a desire to understand. That's all I can ask for. That they remember. That they carry the story forward. Last year, I made a trip back to Kentucky. It was the first time I'd been there in decades, and the mountains felt both familiar and strange. So much had changed. So much remained the same. I visited Vickie's grave, laid flowers on the headstone, and sat for a while in the quiet cemetery surrounded by the bones of my ancestors. I thought about everything that had happened, all the choices I'd made, all the roads I traveled to get here. And I thought about the girl I'd been in 1979, 17 years old, angry and lost and desperate to escape. That girl had found something in the dust and secrets of her family's past, something that had transformed her life forever. She had found purpose. She had found the truth. She had found a reason to keep going when everything seemed dark and hopeless. I spoke to Vickie then, the way I sometimes do when I'm alone. "I hope you're at peace," I said. "I hope you know that you weren't forgotten, that you mattered, that your life, short as it was, meant something." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard a voice on the breeze. "Thank you," it whispered. "Thank you for finding me." I smiled and wiped the tears from my eyes. "Always," I said. "Always." I drove back to Arizona the next day, back to my little house and my memories and my photographs on the walls. I'm telling you this story now because I want you to understand something. The secrets we bury have a way of rising up. The truth we try to hide always finds a way into the light. And the people we lose, the ones who are taken from us too soon, they don't really disappear. They live on in the stories we tell, the memories we keep, the justice we seek on their behalf. Vickie Lynn Belk was 16 years old when she died. She never got to grow up, to fall in love, to have children of her own. She never got to see the world beyond those Kentucky mountains, never got to become whoever she was meant to be. But she is remembered. She is honored. And her death, terrible as it was, led to changes that saved countless other lives. That is her victory. That is her redemption. And that is why I will never stop telling her story. So if you're watching this, if you've stayed with me until the end, I want you to do something. I want you to think about the secrets in your own family, the questions you've been afraid to ask, the truths you've been avoiding. And then I want you to ask them, because you never know what you might find. You never know whose story you might uncover, whose memory you might honor, whose life you might change. The truth is worth finding. It always is. This is Sarah Jane Combs, signing off. And wherever you are, Vickie Lynn, I hope you're finally home.